My name is Paul Miller, and in 2009, I decided it was a good idea to take my RV deep into the Bitterroot National Forest. I figured, what better way to disconnect from the world than to be surrounded by nature? I'm not one of those off-the-grid survivalists. I'm just a guy who likes his quiet time and a break from the endless noise of civilization. I used to joke that the only thing more exhausting than my job was listening to my own brain at night, so a few days out here would do me good. I'd spent the better part of my life working in a cubicle, buried under stacks of paperwork. I figured that with a week off, I might as well take a drive to one of the most remote places in the country. I wasn't worried about anything serious happening. The way I saw it, the worst thing I'd have to deal with was maybe an overenthusiastic park ranger telling me not to park in certain spots or scolding me about campfire safety. Boy, was I wrong about that. I got settled into my little campsite, parked the RV, cracked open a beer, and stretched out in my chair. For the first time in months, I could feel my muscles relax. The sounds of the forest, birds chirping, the rustle of wind through the trees felt like music compared to the constant hum of office printers and ringing phones. It didn't take long before I found myself falling asleep to the sounds of the wild. Peaceful, right? Well, it wasn't long before I found out why no one else seemed eager to camp out this far. Around the second night, things started to feel off. The first strange thing? A lone shoe by a tree. Not a pair. Just one single, worn-out boot. There was no one around to claim it. I made a joke to myself, something about a poor guy hopping home on one foot, but it felt weird. Something about seeing that lonely boot in the middle of nowhere sat wrong with me. I decided to leave it alone, thinking maybe someone had forgotten it on a hike. Later that night, while I was cooking dinner over the fire, I heard it, the scream. It wasn't a regular scream. This one cut through the air like a knife, jagged and desperate, like someone pleading for their life. My first instinct was that it was probably some animal. You hear all sorts of weird sounds in the forest at night, and people often mistake wildlife for something more sinister, but the scream came again. And again. Each time it sounded less like an animal and more like someone in serious trouble. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the direction of the noise, my heartbeat pounding louder than my footsteps with each step. That sound, the crying, the shouting, grew more distant. By the time I was deeper into the woods, I realized how isolated I really was. The campsite and RV were far behind me, the dim light of my fire just a tiny flicker through the trees, and still that screaming kept going. Then I saw something, or rather someone, moving through the trees, maybe 30 yards ahead of me. I could barely make out a figure in the low light. They weren't running, but walking fast, darting between the trees. I shouted to them, asking if they needed help, but they didn't respond. They just kept moving. So, like an idiot, I kept following. Eventually, I got close enough to see him, dirty, thin, his clothes ripped like he'd been living in the woods for weeks, maybe longer. His face was gaunt, and his skin looked like it hadn't seen a shower in months. He was carrying something in his hand, a knife. No, something sharp, jagged. It was hard to tell in the dark. Then the screaming stopped. Everything went quiet. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy on your chest, like the whole world was holding its breath. He turned to look at me just as I came up from behind a tree. That's when I saw the blood. His hands, his clothes, they were stained thick and fresh. He didn't seem bothered that I'd caught up with him. He didn't even try to run. He just stared at me like he was waiting to see what I'd do next. His eyes, though I promised I wouldn't mention them, had a look I couldn't shake, dead inside. I froze. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there like a deer caught in headlights, but my legs wouldn't move. I managed to choke out, "What the hell did you do?" He tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange sound, and then, in the most casual tone I've ever heard in my life, he said, "You hear them too?" I wasn't sure what he meant by them, but I didn't care to ask. Now, most people in this kind of situation would probably do the smart thing, turn around and get the hell out of there. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I was standing face to face with a man who had clearly just done something awful. And for some reason, my brain was stuck on one thought. Is he alone? Was he part of something bigger, some group of psychos living out here in the wilderness? Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely managed to jump back, my flashlight clattering to the ground. He swung whatever was in his hand, an old rusted machete, I think, and missed me by inches. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned and ran. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps fast and relentless behind me. But something weird happened. After a few minutes of running, the footsteps just stopped. I didn't look back. I kept running until I reached my campsite, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I slammed the RV door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. When I finally got through, I told them everything, and they assured me they'd send someone out. It felt like hours before I heard the sirens. When the rangers and local deputies showed up, I was ready to believe they'd think I was crazy, some out-of-towner rattled by the isolation of the woods. But they didn't. They didn't even look surprised. They took me to a nearby ranger station for questioning, and that's when I found out why. I wasn't the first one to encounter this guy. Apparently, for years, campers had been disappearing from the area. Some had been found mutilated, others never seen again. They had a name for him, Marcus Gray. Gray used to be some kind of survivalist, a loner who'd lived in these woods for years. After his family died in a car accident, he just snapped. He'd been living off the land, attacking anyone unlucky enough to wander too far into his territory. And those screams I heard, the police had been hearing them too. They'd set up searches, but no one could ever find where he was hiding, until that night. They eventually found Gray the next day hiding in an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. His machete was still stained, and so were the walls of the cabin. He wasn't alone when they found him. There were bodies, 3 of them, strewn around the cabin like forgotten dolls. People who had gone missing weeks before ever showing up. They shot him when he tried to attack the officers. Marcus Gray was dead. But the real kicker? Turns out the guy didn't kill for any logical reason. He just did it. Some part of his mind broke all those years ago, and he decided to take others with him into that abyss. There was no big conspiracy, no hidden agenda, just a broken man doing awful things. As I packed up my RV and left the next day, I couldn't help but think about what the rangers told me. If you hear screaming in the woods, run the other way. Guess that's one piece of advice I'll never ignore again. I remember that trip like it was yesterday. Took the RV up to the Ozarks, me and my buddy Stan. We were looking for a quiet place to fish, maybe drink a few beers and shoot the breeze. We found a spot near a lake, tucked away in the woods. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. We set up camp, got the fire going, and just relaxed. Nothing fancy, just 2 old friends enjoying the great outdoors. Stan was a character, always had a story or a joke. He worked in construction, had the rough hands and tan skin to prove it. I'd known him since high school, and though our lives had taken different paths, we always found time for trips like these. He had this laugh that could fill a room, or in this case, the entire forest. We spent the first day just fishing off the dock, not catching much, but that didn't matter. The air was crisp, the beer was cold, and the conversation was easy. By nightfall, we had a small feast of canned beans and grilled sausages, washed down with a few more beers. The stars were out in full force, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt like we were the only 2 people on Earth. The second day, we decided to explore the woods a bit. Stan wanted to find a good hiking trail he'd heard about. We didn't have any maps, just his vague memories from some article he'd read. We wandered through the trees, laughing about how lost we were going to get. The woods were dense, but not intimidating. Just a lot of green, the smell of pine, and the rustle of leaves underfoot. We found the trail eventually. It led us to an old abandoned cabin. It was creepy, sure, but we were more curious than anything. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We poked around a bit, finding nothing but dust and cobwebs. Stan joked about it being haunted, but we both knew better, just an old shack, forgotten by time. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting. We were tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from a day well spent. We settled in for another night around the fire, feeling content, and then we heard it, a scream. Not an animal, but a human scream, somewhere off in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. Stan and I looked at each other, the laughter gone from our faces. We weren't sure what to do. We couldn't just ignore it, but we also didn't want to run blindly into the woods. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the sound, cautiously. The woods at night were a different beast. Every shadow seemed to move, and the silence was heavy, oppressive. We called out, but got no response. The scream had stopped, and there was no way to pinpoint where it had come from. After what felt like hours, we decided to head back to camp, uneasy but unsure what else to do. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little noise had us on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we drifted off. I woke up to the smell of coffee and Stan's muttering. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, joining him. "Not really," he replied, eyes still fixed on the fire. "You?" "Barely," I admitted. "That scream, yeah." He finally looked at me. "Think we should check it out again?" "Maybe," I said. "But where do we even start?" We decided to retrace our steps from the previous night, hoping to find some clue we might have missed in the dark. The woods seemed less intimidating in the daylight, but the unease lingered. We walked in silence, our ears tuned to every sound. Then we found it. A patch of ground, disturbed. Dirt kicked up, and something else. "Blood," Stan said. Not a lot, but enough to make our hearts race. We followed the trail, and that's when we saw it. A body, partially hidden by the underbrush. It was a man, or what was left of him. His clothes were torn, and his face was unrecognizable. Stan turned away, retching. "Jesus," I muttered, feeling my stomach churn. "What the hell happened here?" Stan wiped his mouth, his face pale. "We need to get help." We hurried back to camp, grabbed our phones, and called the local sheriff. It took them a while to get out there, the area being so remote. When they arrived, they took our statements, asked a lot of questions we didn't have answers to. They didn't seem surprised, which was unsettling in its own way. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Tomlin, pulled me aside. "You boys didn't see anything else? No one else out here?" "No, just the body," I said. "What do you think happened?" Tomlin sighed, looking tired. "Hard to say, could be a lot of things. This area, it has a history. Folks around here talk about things in the woods. Could be a bear, maybe something else. We'll investigate, but..." He looked me dead in the eyes. "I wouldn't stick around if I were you." Stan and I packed up that day. The thrill of the trip was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of dread. We didn't talk much on the drive back. There wasn't much to say. What could we say? We had come out here for a break, a bit of fun, and instead we stumbled into a nightmare. Weeks passed, and the story faded from the news. The official explanation was a wild animal attack, but there were whispers, rumors that didn't sit well. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that wasn't a bear or a cougar. Stan and I kept in touch, but we didn't talk about the trip. It was like an unspoken agreement to leave it buried. But then, about a month later, Stan went missing. He had gone out on another trip, this time alone. His wife called me, frantic. I joined the search party, but we found nothing, just his abandoned campsite, eerily similar to the one we had shared. The police chalked it up to another animal attack, but I knew better. There was something in those woods, something that took Stan. I tried to tell the sheriff, but he dismissed me, said I was letting my imagination run wild. But I knew that whatever was out there was real, and it had a taste for blood. I started digging, looking into local legends and folklore. That's when I came across the stories of the Nix, a creature said to haunt the Ozarks, preying on those who wandered too far from safety. The descriptions varied, but the one constant was its hunger, its need to hunt. I don't know if I believe in monsters, not in the traditional sense, but I believe there's something out there, something that took my friend, and I'll keep looking until I find it. or it finds me. Because one thing's for sure, the Nyx is real. And it's hungry. I made only minor tweaks for clarity while preserving your voice and tone. I've always told myself I came out here to find peace. After Emily died, I needed to get away from the pitying looks, the hushed conversations, the casseroles left on my doorstep. People meant well, but every act of kindness reminded me of what I'd lost. So I sold the house, bought the RV, and hit the road. At first, it was liberating. Just me, the open wilderness, and no one to answer to. But now, deep in the boundary waters with snow piling up outside and the heater sputtering its last breath, I was starting to think I'd made a mistake. The solitude that once felt like freedom now felt like a cage. It had been snowing for 3 days straight. My RV was parked on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by a dense forest of pine and birch. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional howl of a wolf or the groan of ice shifting under the snow. I'd chosen this spot for its isolation. No cell service, no people. Just me, my thoughts, and the wilderness. But the reality of winter camping was harsher than I'd anticipated. The cold seeped into every crevice of the RV, and the wood I'd gathered for my campfire burned faster than I could replenish it. The first strange thing happened on my second night. I was outside gathering snow to melt for water when I noticed the claw marks. They were etched into the bark of a tree near the RV, deep and deliberate. I frowned, running my gloved fingers over the grooves. Too large for a wolf or a bear. Maybe the previous camper had a dog, I told myself, but the thought didn't sit right. The next morning, I went out to gather firewood and found the deer carcass. It was lying in the snow a few hundred yards from my campsite, its ribcage split open and its entrails strewn across the ground. The strangest part was that no meat had been taken. The kill was fresh, the blood still glistening, but whatever had done this hadn't eaten a bite. Tracks surrounded the carcass, humanoid, but with long, clawed toes that sank deep into the snow. My stomach turned. Wolves, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Wolves don't leave kills untouched. That night, I locked the RV door and kept the fire burning until I fell asleep. The dream started on the third night. In the dream, I was walking through the woods, the trees twisting and groaning around me. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched underfoot. A shadow moved ahead, gaunt and skeletal, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "Ethan, you are not strong enough." I woke with a start, my breath fogging in the freezing air. My heater had given out during the night, leaving the RV an icy tomb. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I relit the camp stove. When I opened the curtains, I saw footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the forest to my RV, circling it in a tight spiral before disappearing back into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. By the fourth day, my food stores were dwindling. I'd rationed carefully, but something had raided my supplies overnight. Packages of dried meat were scattered in the snow, their contents shredded and uneaten. My gas canisters for the backup stove were missing. I searched the RV from top to bottom, but there was no sign of them. The whispers started that afternoon. I was chopping wood when I heard it, a low, guttural growl followed by a voice calling my name. "Ethan." I froze, my breath visible in the frigid air. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, my axe gripped tightly in my hand. "Who's there?" I shouted. The forest stared back at me, silent and indifferent. That night, I saw it. I was sitting by the fire, my axe within reach, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked up and saw it standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, emaciated, and unnervingly silent. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, mottled with patches of frostbitten flesh. Antlers jutted from its skull, their jagged tips catching the firelight. Its eyes glowed yellow, unblinking. I reached for my axe, but the creature didn't move. It just stared at me, its breath fogging in the cold air. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice trembling. The Wendigo tilted its head as if considering my words. Then, with unnatural speed, it darted forward, stopping just short of the fire. Its clawed hand reached out, dragging across the RV's window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. I stumbled backward, falling into the snow. When I looked up, it was gone. The next morning, I found an old book buried in one of my storage bins. It was a collection of local legends, something I'd picked up at a roadside shop during my travels. Flipping through its pages, I found a chapter on the Wendigo. According to the legend, the Wendigo was a spirit of hunger and greed, preying on those who ventured too far into the wilderness. It drove its victims mad, whispering their fears and failures until they gave in to despair. The book mentioned fire as a potential deterrent, along with the importance of resisting its psychological influence. "You must not succumb," the text read. "To fall into despair is to invite the Wendigo into your soul." That night, the Wendigo came closer. I fortified the RV as best I could, piling firewood around the perimeter and keeping my torch within reach. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their mournful cadence. "Ethan," the Wendigo hissed, its voice seeping through the walls. "You are weak. You will not survive." I clenched my hands into fists, trying to block it out. "Shut up," I muttered over and over. The fire outside roared, but the heat felt fragile against the encroaching cold. The Wendigo appeared again, its skeletal frame illuminated by the flames. "You are alone," it whispered. "You have always been alone." I grabbed the torch and stumbled outside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Leave me alone," I shouted, thrusting the flames toward the creature. The Wendigo recoiled, its body flickering like a shadow in the firelight. For a moment I thought I'd driven it off. Then it lunged. The next moments were a blur. The Wendigo's claws raked across my arm, sending me sprawling into the snow. Pain shot through me, hot and sharp, but I didn't let go of the torch. I swung it wildly, the flames licking at the creature's frostbitten skin. It shrieked, a high, keening wail that pierced the night. The fire roared higher, embers scattering into the darkness. The Wendigo retreated, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "This is not over," it hissed, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the snow had stopped, and the road out of the Boundary Waters was clear enough to drive. I packed up the RV with shaking hands, leaving behind most of my gear. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its shadows stretching long and dark across the snow. I haven't returned to the wilderness since. Even now, I hear the Wendigo's whispers in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edge of solitude. But I survived. For now, that's enough. My name is Brian Gibson, and this happened to me on August 15th, 2008. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from the noise and stress of the city. I'd taken the RV out to the woods near Salt Creek in the Kiamichi Mountains of Oklahoma. I like to camp alone sometimes, just me, nature, and a cooler full of beer. No phones, no internet, just peace and quiet. I arrived around noon, found a nice spot by the creek, and set up camp. The place was deserted, just as I had hoped. I parked the RV under a big oak tree, close enough to the water to hear it gurgling over the rocks. After setting up a small fire pit and getting my fishing gear ready, I cracked open a beer and settled into my folding chair, feeling the stress of the city melt away. The first day was perfect. I caught a couple of fish, enough for dinner, and spent the evening cooking over the fire and listening to the sounds of the forest. By nightfall, the sky was clear and the stars were out in full force. I stretched out on a blanket, stared up at the Milky Way, and thought about nothing in particular. Eventually, I crawled into the RV and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling refreshed. I decided to take a hike further upstream. I left most of my stuff at the campsite, taking only a small backpack with some water, snacks, and my hunting knife. The trail was faint, barely more than a game path, but it was easy enough to follow along the creek. The farther I went, the denser the forest became. The trees were taller, the underbrush thicker, and the sound of the creek echoed in a way that made everything seem both closer and farther away. About an hour into the hike, I found an old abandoned cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, and looked like it had been there for decades. The roof had partially caved in, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look inside. The place was empty, just a few pieces of broken furniture and a rusted-out stove. There was a strange, musty smell like wet earth and decay, but nothing too unusual for a place left to the elements. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd on the floor near the back wall. It looked like a small wooden trapdoor, half covered by a rotting rug. I moved the rug aside and tried to lift the door, but it was stuck. I pulled harder, and with a creak and a cloud of dust, it finally gave way. Beneath the door was a narrow, dark hole about the size of a manhole cover, leading down into the ground. A rusty metal ladder was bolted to one side, disappearing into the darkness below. I debated with myself for a moment, then decided to go down. I don't know why. Maybe it was the explorer in me, or maybe just plain stupidity. I clicked on my flashlight and started down the ladder. It was damp and cold, and the smell of wet earth grew stronger the deeper I went. The ladder ended after about 20 feet, dropping me into a small underground chamber. The walls were lined with stone, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. At first glance, it looked like some kind of root cellar, but there was something off about it. I shone my light around and saw what looked like old tools, some rotting wood, and crates. Then, in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were bones, human bones, scattered across the floor. Some looked old and brittle, but others seemed more recent, still covered in bits of rotting flesh. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I turned to climb back up the ladder when I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling sound. I whipped around, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Nothing. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just rats or some other animal. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. I scrambled up the ladder, almost dropping my flashlight in my haste. I didn't look back until I was out of the hole and had slammed the trapdoor shut. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I needed to get back to the RV, get my phone, and call the authorities. I started back down the trail, moving faster than I probably should have. About halfway back to the campsite, I heard something crashing through the underbrush behind me. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other animal. Instead, I saw a shape, tall and hunched, moving through the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette against the greenery. It moved strangely, almost like it was limping. I didn't wait to see more. I took off running, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the campsite and dove into the RV, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. I cursed and threw the phone down, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I started the engine, but as I looked out the window, I saw the shape again, moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was closer now, and I could see more details. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with long, matted hair and a face that looked more animal than human. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward. I heard a thud and a scrape as something hit the side of the vehicle. I didn't stop. I drove down the narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the RV. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the main road. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police station. I told them everything I'd seen. They looked skeptical, but agreed to send someone out to check the cabin. They asked me to stay in town in case they had more questions. I agreed, but I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't get the image of those bones out of my head or the way that thing had moved through the trees. The next day, the police called me in. They said they'd found the cabin and the trapdoor, but no bones. The place looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. They asked if I might have imagined it, maybe had a bit too much to drink. I swore I hadn't, but they just gave me that look people give when they think you're crazy. They told me to go home and get some rest. I left town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. I kept thinking about those bones and the way that thing had looked at me. I did some research when I got home, trying to find any information about the area. I found stories, old legends about a creature that lived in the woods. Here's the corrected version of your paragraph with spelling and grammar adjustments. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police station. I told them everything I'd seen. They looked skeptical, but agreed to send someone out to check the cabin. They asked me to stay in town in case they had more questions. I agreed, but I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't get the image of those bones out of my head or the way that thing had moved through the trees. The next day, the police called me in. They said they'd found the cabin and the trapdoor, but no bones. The place looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. They asked if I might have imagined it, maybe had a bit too much to drink. I swore I hadn't, but they just gave me that look people give when they think you're crazy. They told me to go home and get some rest. I left town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. I kept thinking about those bones and the way that thing had looked at me. I did some research when I got home, trying to find any information about the area. I found stories, old legends about a creature that lived in the woods, something the locals called skog. It was supposed to be some kind of ancient spirit, a guardian of the forest that punished those who trespassed. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but I can't deny what I saw. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. I sold the RV and moved to a different state, as far from Oklahoma. My name is Gary Ellis. I'm 43 years old, and this happened in September of 2023 during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip to Tedo State Park in Minnesota. I've been camping for most of my adult life, first with my husband Peter, and later on my own after he passed away last year. Tedo was our favorite spot, especially in the fall, when the leaves along the cliffs turned fiery red and gold. It felt like the right place to reconnect with him in a way and to prove to myself that I could keep going, even without him. Looking back, I should have chosen someplace else. I arrived at Tedo on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of day that makes you feel lucky to be alive. The air was sharp and clean, scented with pine and the tang of Lake Superior. My RV was parked in a secluded spot near one of the less popular trails. From there, I planned to hike out to High Falls, do some bird watching, and maybe find time to take a longer hike to the backwoods near Bear Lake. The ranger at the visitor center, an older man named Gabe, handed me a trail map and gave me a curious look. "You camping alone?" "Yeah," I said. "Is that a problem?" He hesitated. "Not a problem, but stick to the marked trails, okay? People get turned around out here. A compass won't always help you." I smiled politely, used to this kind of warning. "I'll be careful." He leaned closer. "And if you hear something calling your name out there, don't answer." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. He didn't laugh back. My first hike was uneventful, peaceful even. I spent the day watching chickadees flit through the trees and trying to photograph a bald eagle perched high above the baptism river. By the time I got back to my RV, the sun was setting, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and crimson. That first night, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and stretched out with a book. It was quiet, just the way I liked it, until the knocking started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I imagined it. 3 knocks spaced out on the side of the RV. I froze, listening. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the faint rustle of the wind in the pines. I turned on the exterior lights and peered out the window, but there was no one there. No footprints in the dirt, nothing. I told myself it was the wind, even though I knew better. The next morning I shook off the unease and headed out for the longer hike to Bear Lake. The trail wound through dense forest, where sunlight filtered faintly through the canopy, dappling the path with patches of light. That's when I saw it. the first sign that something wasn't right. About a mile into the hike, I came across claw marks on a tree. They were deep, like something with massive talons had scraped against the bark. The forest here wasn't known for black bears, and besides, the claw marks were too high, too wide. I told myself it had to be some other animal, lynx maybe, but the sight of it stayed with me, a nagging thought I couldn't shake. I pushed on, stopping occasionally to photograph the way the light hit the trees. The trail narrowed as I approached Bear Lake, and that's when I saw her. A woman was sitting on a boulder near the edge of the trail. She was thin, with shoulder-length brown hair and pale skin that seemed too white against the deep green of the forest. "Hi there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. She didn't respond right away, just tilted her head slightly as though listening for something. "You okay?" I asked, stepping closer. Finally, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were gray, empty somehow, like she wasn't fully there. "I'm lost," she said, her voice soft and monotone. "Lost? How long have you been out here?" She blinked slowly. "I don't know, a while." Something about her didn't feel right. Her clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt were perfectly clean, with no dirt or sweat stains, even though she claimed to have been lost for days. I offered to walk her back to the main trail, but she shook her head. "You shouldn't go deeper," she said, her voice taking on an edge of urgency. "It's not safe." "Why not?" But she didn't answer. She just stood up and walked into the trees, moving so quickly and silently that it was like she'd never been there at all. By the time I reached Bear Lake, the day felt off. The lake was as still as glass, its surface reflecting the sky and trees with unsettling clarity. I tried to focus on taking pictures, but my unease only grew. When I looked at my watch, 3 hours had passed. That didn't make sense. I'd been hiking for maybe an hour, 2 at most. I decided to head back, but the trail seemed different. I couldn't explain it, but the trees felt closer, the light dimmer, the path twisted in ways I didn't remember. And I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that vanished when I turned to look. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scratching sound, like claws on metal. I stayed in the RV, clutching the kitchen knife I kept for emergencies, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it. Nova. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Peter's voice, my husband's. "Nova, come outside." Tears welled up in my eyes. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was real, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. "Nova, it's me. Please." I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, refusing to listen. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up the RV and tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. Again and again, it refused to turn over. Panicking, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to the visitor center, but the forest seemed determined to keep me there. The trail shifted, the trees pressing closer, the whispers growing louder. They weren't Peter's voice anymore. They were a chorus, hundreds of voices murmuring in a language I didn't understand. And then I saw her again. The woman from before. She was standing in the middle of the trail, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "It feeds on grief," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "What feeds on grief?" I demanded. But before she could answer, her body began to disintegrate, crumbling into ash that was carried away on the wind. That night was the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The knocking came again, this time so loud it shook the RV. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, filling my ears. And then I saw it, a figure standing just outside the window. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face a blank, featureless mask. It didn't move, it just stared. The final straw came when I stumbled upon a clearing filled with abandoned belongings, rusted tents, broken camping gear, even an old RV, its windows shattered and frame overtaken by moss. In the center was an ancient stone altar, slick with something dark and wet. A single voice called out, louder than the others, Peter's voice. "Nova, please. We can be together again." I knew it wasn't him, but I was so tired, so broken. I stepped toward the altar, tears streaming down my face. But then I remembered. I pulled the locket from around my neck, the one that held Peter's photo, and hurled it at the altar with all my strength. The moment it struck, there was a blinding light followed by a deafening silence. When I came to, I was lying on the side of the main road. Gabe was there, shaking me awake. "Nova," he said, his voice laced with concern. "What the hell happened to you?" I couldn't answer, confess. I just climbed into the RV, which now started without a hitch, and drove away. I haven't been back to Tedo since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest sound of knocking. And I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. My name is Jonathan Martin, and back in 2018, I found myself deep in the heart of the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. I was there to escape the noise of city life, thinking a week of solitude might do me some good. Funny how I thought trading honking horns for howling winds was a smart move. I had always been an outdoorsy type, or at least that's what my dating profile said. Truth be told, the closest I'd been to roughing it was a weekend at a lakeside cabin with Wi-Fi and a fully stocked fridge. But after a rough breakup and a particularly brutal week at work, I decided it was time to reconnect with nature, or at least give it a firm handshake. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked along well-marked trails, took pictures of anything that looked remotely scenic, and tried to convince myself that instant oatmeal was a suitable substitute for real food. I even attempted to start a campfire without using a lighter, which resulted in nothing but blisters and a newfound respect for modern technology. On the third day, I decided to venture a bit further off the beaten path. I stumbled upon an old trail that wasn't on any of the maps I had. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown with weeds and framed by towering pines that seemed to lean in just a bit too close. "Adventure awaits," I muttered to myself, trying to sound enthusiastic. In hindsight, I should have turned back right then, but curiosity has a way of nudging you forward, much like how my mother nudges me about grandkids. As I walked, the forest grew denser. The sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder every few minutes. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my city nerves. "Get a grip, Nate," I whispered. "You're probably the scariest thing out here." Not my best pep talk, but it was all I had. About an hour in, I came across something strange, a clearing with a dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient, like it had been abandoned decades ago. The windows were shattered, the door hung off its hinges, and the wood was warped and rotten. For reasons I can't quite explain, I felt compelled to check it out. Maybe I was hoping to find some rustic charm or at least a good story to tell at parties. As I approached, a foul smell hit me, something pungent, metallic, and unmistakably rotten. I covered my nose and hesitated. Probably just a dead animal, I thought, trying to convince myself. But as I peeked inside, I realized I was half right. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered debris, but what caught my eye, or rather turned my stomach, were the remains of several animals scattered across the floor, bones picked clean, some still with bits of flesh clinging on. I stepped back, feeling a wave of nausea. "Well, that's enough National Geographic for one day," I mumbled, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. I retraced my steps, but after a few minutes, I realized the path I had taken was nowhere to be found. Trees that looked familiar led to places that didn't. Panic started to set in. I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun aimlessly. Perfect. Lost in the woods with a faulty compass. Just my luck. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the shadows stretched longer and the temperature dropped. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that people get lost in the woods all the time and make it out just fine. Besides, I joked to no one, Bear Grylls made a career out of it. Maybe I'll get a TV deal out of this. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a landmark, or, at the very least, a cell signal. As darkness enveloped the forest, I heard something. A distant rustling followed by a low huffing sound. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon, or any number of harmless woodland creatures that wouldn't mind sharing their GPS coordinates. But the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. Twigs snapped under heavy footsteps, and leaves crunched with each movement. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. Suddenly, a figure darted between the trees ahead, a large, hulking shape that moved with a natural speed. It was too big to be a deer and too swift to be a bear. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. Silence. Then a guttural snarl, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, resonant, and sent a chill down my spine. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my face as I barreled through the underbrush. Behind me, the footsteps quickened. Whatever it was following me, and it was fast. I glanced back and caught a glimpse of it. A massive creature covered in matted fur, muscles rippling under its hide. It moved on all fours, but had a gait that seemed almost wrong, like it could switch to two legs at any moment. Desperation kicked in. I veered off to the right, hoping to throw it off. Up ahead, I saw a fallen tree bridging a shallow ravine. Without thinking, I dashed across it. Halfway over, the trunk started to wobble. I leaped to the other side just as the log gave way, crashing into the rocky stream below. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, but it was short-lived. The creature appeared on the opposite bank, its eyes locked onto me in the dim light. I could make out its features, a snout like a wolf but broader, with teeth that seemed too large for its mouth. Its eyes reflected the faint moonlight, giving them an eerie glow. "Not good, not good," I whispered, backing away slowly. It let out a roar, a sound so fierce it vibrated in my chest. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. I stumbled upon a narrow cave entrance, barely visible behind a curtain of ivy. Without options, I squeezed inside, pressing myself against the cold, damp stone. The cave was shallow, offering little protection, but it was all I had. The creature approached, sniffing the air. I could hear it prowling outside, its claws scraping against the rocks. It let out a series of huffs, and for a moment I thought it might move on. Then a massive arm reached into the cave, claws raking the space where my head had been moments before. I flattened myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. It couldn't reach me, but it wasn't giving up. The creature began clawing at the entrance, widening the gap inch by inch. Stones crumbled and dust filled the air. I frantically searched the cave for anything I could use. My hands closed around a hefty rock, and as its head started to push through the opening, I swung the rock with every ounce of strength I had. It connected with a sickening thud, and the creature recoiled, letting out a pained howl. Seizing the moment, I scrambled out of the cave, darting past the stunned beast. It swiped at me, catching the sleeve of my jacket and tearing it clean off. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Up ahead, I saw lights flickering between the trees, a campsite bursting into the clearing. I startled a group of hikers gathered around a fire. "Help! There's something out there!" I shouted, my voice ragged. They looked at me, faces etched with confusion and concern. Before they could respond, the creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing. The hikers gasped, and one of them fumbled for a flashlight, shining it directly at the beast. In the full light, it was even more terrifying, a towering figure with the muscular build of a predator and the wild eyes of a feral animal. Its fur was dark and matted, and its jaws were lined with sharp teeth, glistening with saliva. One of the hikers pulled out a flare gun. Why he had one, I didn't question. He fired it directly at the creature. The flare struck its shoulder, igniting its fur. The beast let out a deafening roar, thrashing wildly as flames spread across its body. "Move now," another hiker shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. The group scattered, running toward the vehicles parked nearby. I jumped into the back of a pickup truck just as the engine roared to life. We sped down a dirt road, the fiery glow fading behind us. Breathing heavily, I glanced back. The creature was nowhere in sight. The driver, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, looked at me through the rearview mirror. "What in God's name was that?" he asked. I shook my head, still trying to process everything. I have no idea, I replied, but I think we just ruined its evening. Another hiker chuckled nervously. Well, remind me to leave a bad review for this campground. 0 stars for monstrous wildlife. We reached the nearest ranger station and reported the incident. They looked skeptical but sent out a team to investigate. Hours later, they returned with grim expressions. They had found the burned remains of something they couldn't or wouldn't identify. Over the next few days, news spread about unexplained animal attacks in the area. Authorities chalked it up to a rogue bear, advising everyone to steer clear of the forest until they could ensure safety. I knew better. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't alone. Reports came in of missing hikers, mauled bodies discovered by search parties. Each incident more gruesome than the last. I left South Dakota vowing to stick to city parks from then on. A swing set and a hot dog stand sounded a lot more appealing than anything the wilderness had to offer. A few weeks later, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article detailing local legends of shape-shifting creatures that roamed the Black Hills, a tale dismissed as folklore. But legends have to start somewhere, don't they? My name is Carol Sanders, and I was 36 when this happened in the fall of 2024. I don't usually scare easily. I've spent most of my adult life chasing eerie landscapes, crumbling buildings, and abandoned places for my photography projects. But what happened to me at Sugarloaf Cove still haunts me, literally. It all started as part of a photo essay I was working on for a travel magazine. The theme was haunted landscapes, and Sugarloaf Cove on Minnesota's North Shore had all the right ingredients. The rugged cliffs, the dense forests, and the fog that blanketed the lake most mornings made it perfect. Even better, there were local legends about miners who disappeared near an old shaft in the late 1800s. Supposedly they were still out there, wandering the woods, restless and angry. Legends, I thought, perfect for the story. I drove my RV up to the cove, parking it at the edge of a trail that wasn't on the map but looked promising. The spot was remote, tucked away from the main paths, just the way I liked it. The air was crisp and cold, and the trees were a riot of orange and red, a photographer's dream. The first day went smoothly enough. I spent hours hiking the shoreline, taking photos of the jagged rocks and the endless expanse of Lake Superior. The water seemed almost alive, its waves pounding the cliffs with a sound that echoed through the trees. But as beautiful as it was, something about the place felt off. The silence was too complete. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. It was just me, the lake, and the wind. I brushed it off. Isolation does that to you. But that night, things got strange. It started with my radio. I usually keep it on for background noise, but instead of the usual static, I started picking up faint, garbled voices. They weren't music or weather reports, just words I couldn't make out, almost like whispers. Thinking it was interference, I turned it off and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately froze. My tripod and camera were set up in the clearing facing the forest. The problem was, I hadn't set them up. I'd packed everything back into the RV before going to bed. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken the day before, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one shot, a wide angle of the trees near the trailhead, there was a figure. It was blurry, almost transparent, but it was there, standing among the trees. It looked human, but the proportions were all wrong, too tall, too thin. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens. Maybe. I grabbed my gear and headed into the woods to find the old mining shaft. That was my goal for the day. Explore the site, get some atmospheric shots, and get out before dark. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the forest. After about an hour of hiking, I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound like metal striking stone. I stopped, listening. The sound was distant but steady, coming from up ahead. My first thought was that it was someone working on a restoration project, but as I got closer, the sound stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I finally found the mining shaft, tucked into the side of a rocky hill. It was half collapsed, the wooden beam supporting the entrance rotting and covered in moss. The air around it was freezing, far colder than it should have been for the time of year. I set up my camera and started taking photos of the shaft and the strange carvings etched into the stone around the entrance. They looked like runes or symbols, their lines sharp and deliberate. That's when my camera battery died. I always carry spares, but when I swapped them out, the camera refused to turn on. Frustrated, I packed up and decided to head back to the RV. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, that low, rhythmic sound of metal on stone. This time, it was closer. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound, steady and deliberate. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I didn't wait to the dark. I hurried back to the RV, my heart racing. When I got back, I locked the doors and double-checked all the windows, which felt ridiculous in the moment, but gave me some comfort. That night, the radio came on by itself. The static returned, louder than before, and the whispers were clearer now. I couldn't make out full sentences, but the words "leave" and "mine" stood out. Then the motion detector light outside flickered on. I froze, staring at the window. There was nothing there, but a few moments later, the scratching started, slow, deliberate scratches on the metal siding of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the door, shining the beam into the darkness. The clearing was empty, but as I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints leading away from the RV. They were human-shaped, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I couldn't ignore what was happening. I pulled out my laptop and started researching the mining shaft, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen and heard. That's when I found an old blog post from a hiker who'd been to Sugarloaf years earlier. He mentioned the same symbols and strange occurrences, and spoke of something he called the shadows of Sugarloaf. According to the post, they were the restless spirits of miners who had been trapped and starved to death during a collapse in the 1800s. The carvings were warnings left by the Ajibu, meant to keep people away from the cursed ground. That evening, I decided to go back to the shaft. I didn't want to, but something compelled me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The forest felt different this time. Heavier, like it was watching me. When I reached the shaft, I saw something I'd missed before, a crude pile of rocks near the entrance. It was a grave, I realized, a shallow one. I hesitated, but the air around me grew colder, and the low sound of metal on stone started again, louder than ever. My hands shook as I knelt and uncovered the rocks, revealing a tangle of bones beneath. The moment I did, the shadows in the shaft moved. They weren't just darkness, they were shapes, tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes that glowed faintly. They moved toward me, silent but deliberate. I stumbled back, tripping over my gear, and the shadows stopped just short of the grave as if bound by it. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My memory of that part is a blur. What I do remember is the pounding on the walls that night. The shadows weren't bound to the grave anymore. They surrounded the RV, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. By dawn, the pounding stopped. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. The RV was covered in deep scratches, and the motion detector lights were shattered. I thought I was safe after that, but the shadows didn't stay in Sugarloaf. Weeks later, back in my apartment, I started hearing the whispers again. The motion detector lights flickered, and every now and then I'd wake up to find claw-like scratches on the walls. The shadows are still with me, waiting, watching, and I know they'll never let me go. My name's Nathan Matthews, and back in 2013, I took my RV up to the Uncompahgre National Forest in Colorado to get a bit of solitude. I figured a few days in the quiet woods was what I needed after a brutal stretch at my job. That and a chance to unwind and catch up on some reading I'd been putting off for too long. The campsite was perfect, a little slice of isolation in a pine grove near a mountain stream. There weren't any other campers around, just the way I liked it. After parking, I set up a small fire pit, rolled out a camp chair, and opened a cold beer. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed the first strange thing. Hanging from a tree just outside the edge of the camp was a bundle of what looked like animal bones tied together with rough twine. I remember squinting at it, trying to figure out if I was looking at some kind of decoration or a hunter's marker. I shrugged it off, figuring it was something left behind by previous campers, maybe someone with an odd sense of humor. But as night settled in, there was a strange tension in the air, a feeling like the forest was aware. That's the best way I can put it. And then there was a sound, a low, distant snap of a branch. Now, I'd done plenty of camping, so I knew the usual sounds: animals rustling, branches falling, even the distant howl of a coyote or two. But this wasn't that. It felt deliberate, calculated, like someone was creeping around my campsite, observing me. I called out, maybe hoping it was another camper who had just happened upon the spot. Silence. Not even the crickets joined in. Figuring it was probably my own nerves getting the best of me, I settled back in my chair, trying to brush it off. Maybe I even laughed a little, reminding myself I was out here to relax. But then, just as I was starting to unwind, another noise cut through the night. This time it was closer, and it didn't sound natural. It was a low, whispering voice somewhere in the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but it had a strange rhythm, almost like a chant. I froze, listening harder, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. A chill crept up my spine, and I cursed myself for not bringing anything stronger than a pocket knife. There was a flash of movement. I turned my flashlight toward the trees and saw him, a man standing just outside the ring of light. He was gaunt, dressed in layers of old, tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in years. His face was twisted in a wild grin, eyes wide with something that looked too intense to be curiosity. I called out, asking him if he was lost, but he didn't answer. He just stared, that grin plastered on his face. I started getting that sinking feeling in my stomach, realizing I wasn't dealing with some lost hiker. This guy was here for a reason, and I had a strong feeling it had nothing to do with friendly campfire company. Without a word, he stepped back into the darkness, vanishing from sight, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and that damn silence. I glanced around, debating whether I should pack up and leave, but the road back was rough, and I wasn't eager to navigate it in the dark. So I went back into the RV, locking the door behind me, and grabbed a flashlight and a steak knife, the best I could manage at the time. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every rustle outside set me on edge. Hours seemed to pass with that quiet tension hanging thick in the air. Finally, sometime after midnight, I heard scratching at the door. Not loud, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. I held my breath, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly, ready to hit anything that came through. Then the door handle rattled. I don't remember deciding to open the door, but somehow I did, and there he was, standing right there on the other side, so close I could smell him, a rank mix of sweat and earth. His eyes darted around the inside of the RV before locking on to me. He didn't say anything, but that twisted grin returned. I forced out some words, telling him to leave and that I'd call the cops if he didn't back off. Still, he just stood there, staring. Then, in the most casual way you could imagine, he reached into his coat, pulling out a rusty hunting knife, the kind that looked like it had seen more than just a few animals. "Nice place you got here," he rasped, his voice as rough as gravel. I tried to shut the door, but he wedged his foot in, the grin widening. Panic started to claw at me. I shoved the door as hard as I could, finally managing to get it closed, hearing his foot crunch. His scream of pain echoed through the trees, and it was the most human sound I'd heard from him all night. I'd like to say I felt bad, but survival has a way of dulling empathy. It went quiet after that. I stood by the door, my heart pounding, flashlight in one hand, and that ridiculous steak knife in the other, just waiting. A minute later, I heard footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate, as if he was daring me to come out. Then I smelled smoke. I ran to the tiny window at the back and saw flames licking up the side of the RV, catching on the dry pine needles he'd piled against it. The guy had lit my RV on fire, probably thinking he could smoke me out like some kind of animal. And judging by the wild look in his eyes earlier, he wasn't doing this for kicks. This was personal. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over my shoulder, and kicked the emergency exit open, rolling out into the dirt. The flames were climbing, and as I scrambled to my feet, I saw him standing in the shadows, holding something in his hands. It was my backpack. Must have grabbed it while I was distracted. But it wasn't just the backpack he was holding. Hanging from his other hand was something that made my blood run cold. A severed hand, limp and dripping. The nails were caked with dirt, and I recognized the wristband on it. It was from a kid I'd seen camping with his family a few miles down the trail earlier that day. My mind reeled. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. The twisted satisfaction on his face as he held that hand was paralyzing. I don't know what kind of person it takes to do something like that, but I knew I didn't stand a chance if I tried to reason with him. He tossed the hand to the ground between us as if he was offering me some kind of twisted trophy. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about scaring me. This guy was a predator, someone who's done this before and planned to do it again. I backed up slowly, and he matched me, step for step, that knife glinting in his hand. I could feel my pulse hammering, knowing that if I made one wrong move, he'd close the gap in an instant. My options were narrowing by the second. Then I remembered the emergency flare in my pocket. I fumbled it out, not daring to take my eyes off him. With a quick flick, I sparked it to life, the bright red light flaring up between us, casting long shadows across his face. For the first time, he looked uncertain. It was just enough. I sprinted, hurling the flare behind me, hoping the light and heat would buy me a few seconds. I tore down the trail, lungs burning, not daring to look back. Every sound felt amplified, every snap of a branch like a gunshot. I didn't stop running until I saw the lights of a ranger station up ahead. I stumbled in, gasping, barely able to get the words out. The rangers took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. They radioed for backup and checked the trail where I'd come from. By the time they got there, my RV was a charred skeleton, and there was no sign of him. All they found was a pile of bones, some still smoldering, and a tattered piece of cloth with a name stitched into it. Later, they told me the guy had been living out in those woods for years, scavenging from campers, picking them off one by one. They called him the Hermit of Uncompahgre, a ghost story turned real. As for me, I've never been back, and I don't plan to. The stillness of Donner Lake was the kind that could suffocate you. I chose this spot deliberately, miles away from the nearest campground, the kind of solitude I had come to crave since my life fell apart. The breakup with Aaron, the corporate job I'd hated but couldn't quit, the apartment I could no longer afford, all of it had unraveled in a matter of months. I thought the wilderness would fix me. It hadn't so far, but the idea kept me going. My RV, a creaky old thing I'd patched up myself, had become my home. It rattled like a tin can on rough roads, and the stove barely worked, but it was mine. Donner Lake was meant to be another step on my self-imposed journey of isolation and self-discovery. It wasn't until my second night there that I started to feel like something was watching me. The first day had gone well enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing near the lake, where the trees parted just to give me a view of the water. I spent the afternoon fishing, though I didn't catch much. The lake was stunning, a perfect mirror reflecting the towering pines and jagged mountains. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the water, the beauty of the place began to feel oppressive. By nightfall, my solar generator had decided to give out. I wasn't surprised. It had been acting up for weeks, but the timing was irritating. I rummaged through my supplies, found my backup lantern, and cursed under my breath when I realized the batteries were nearly dead. No big deal, I told myself. I had candles, a campfire, and plenty of matches. The first time I heard the singing, I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. It started soft, just a hum carried by the breeze. I thought it was my imagination until it grew louder, a melody so beautiful and mournful that it sent a chill down my spine. I stood, straining to hear, but the sound faded almost as quickly as it had come. The lake was calm, the surface as smooth as glass. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a bird or the wind playing tricks on me, and went to bed. That night I dreamed of Erin. She was standing in the lake, her pale arms stretched toward me, her lips moved but no sound came out. I tried to wade after her, but the water grew thick like molasses, pulling me under. I woke gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The next morning, I shook off the dream and went about my routine. I cleaned the RV, prepped my fishing gear, and took a short hike around the lake. The air was cool, the scent of pine sharp and inviting, but something felt off. The bird song I had heard the day before was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. At the water's edge, I noticed faint footprints in the mud, barefoot, too small to be mine. They led from the lake to the edge of my campsite and disappeared. I stared at them for a long time, my pulse quickening. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I decided not to think about it. That night, the singing returned. I was inside the RV, flipping through an old travel book I'd picked up at a thrift store when the melody floated through the air. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably human. I stepped outside, my heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the clearing. The lake glowed faintly under the moonlight, its surface rippling ever so slightly. "Hello," I called. The singing stopped for a moment. All I heard was the rustling of the trees. Then came the splash, a soft, deliberate sound like someone wading into the water. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the lake. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the calm, glassy surface. But then I saw it, a shadow beneath the water, moving slowly, deliberately. It was too big to be a fish, too fluid to be a person. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow. The shadow disappeared, and the lake went still again. By the third day, the solitude I'd once craved had turned to dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the singing, the footprints, the shadow. I spent the day repairing the solar generator, more to distract myself than anything else. When I wasn't working, I found myself staring at the lake, my mind replaying the melody over and over. That night, I tried to keep busy. I cooked dinner, read by candlelight, and stoked the fire until it was roaring. But when the singing began again, all my distractions fell away. It was louder now, more insistent. I felt the pull, a strange compulsion to walk toward the lake. I stood at the edge of the water, the melody wrapping around me like a fog. For a moment I thought I saw her, Erin. She was standing waist deep in the water, her arms outstretched, her lips moving in silent song. "Logan," she whispered. I blinked, and she was gone. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was sinking into the lake, my lungs burning, the surface growing farther and farther away. The singing surrounded me, the melody twisting into words I couldn't understand. I woke to the sound of scratching at the RV door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Scritch, scritch. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the door. My hands trembled as I yanked it open. The beam of light cut through the darkness. She was there. Her hair was wet, plastered to her pale face. Her eyes glowed faintly, the light reflecting off the surface of the lake. Water dripped from her tattered dress, pooling at her bare feet. "Logan," she said, her voice soft and lilting. I slammed the door and locked it. The next morning, I found a book buried under a pile of gear I hadn't touched in weeks. It was a collection of local ghost stories, something I'd picked up on a whim in a small-town bookstore. I flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. And there it was, a story about a spirit called the Siren of Donor Lake. According to the legend, she was the ghost of a young woman who had died during the Dare party tragedy. Betrayed and consumed by despair, she lured travelers into the water where they drowned, joining her in her misery. The book mentioned a way to ward her off, fire and a spoken banishment. The details were vague, but it was all I had. That night, the siren came for me. The fire I'd built earlier hissed and sputtered, its light dimming as water began to pool around the campsite. I stood in the doorway of the RV, clutching a makeshift torch, a branch wrapped in cloth, doused in lighter fluid. The singing grew louder, filling the air, vibrating in my chest. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, her pale figure illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes locked on mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow. "Logan," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "Come to me." I stumbled back, clutching the torch like a lifeline. "Stay away." She stepped closer, the water rising around her feet. Her face was a mask of grief and rage, her voice rising in a haunting crescendo. I lit the torch, the flames roaring to life. The siren flinched, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. I shouted the words from the book, though they felt clumsy and foreign on my tongue. "Leave this place. You have no power here." The siren let out a piercing wail, her body twisting and contorting. The water receded, and she disappeared into the shadows. At dawn, I packed up and left. The RV rattled as I sped down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't look back. I still hear the siren's song sometimes, faint and distant, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It reminds me that some places should be left undisturbed and some scars never truly heal. But I survived, and for now, that's enough. My name is Adam Patterson, and this happened to me in September 1994. I was never much of a camper, but I had just bought an old RV from my cousin and thought I'd take it out for a spin. I convinced my buddy, Reed Mayfield, to come along. Reed was the adventurous type, always down for a bit of fun. We planned a weekend trip to a remote spot near the Washington National Forest in Arkansas. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The campsite was perfect, right by a small creek with enough flat ground to park the RV. We set up a fire, cracked open some beers, and spent the evening shooting the breeze. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city, just the sounds of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I remember Reed joking about how the place looked like the perfect setting for a horror movie. We laughed it off, not taking it seriously. We locked the RV door and went to bed. A few hours later, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a faint scratching, like something was brushing against the side of the RV. I figured it was just a branch or some animal, so I tried to ignore it. But then the scratching got louder, more insistent. I sat up, listening intently. Reed was still snoring, oblivious to the noise. "Reed, wake up," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He grumbled and rolled over, but didn't wake up. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a low thumping sound. My heart started pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window, trying to see what was making the noise. I peeked through the curtain, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The flashlight beam flickered as I tried to steady my hand. That's when I saw it, a figure barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and hunched, its limbs long and twisted. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape moving slowly around the RV. "Reed, get up, man," I said louder this time. He finally woke up, blinking groggily. "What's going on?" "Something's outside," I said, my voice shaking. Reed sat up and grabbed his own flashlight. We both stared at the window, waiting. The noises stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence. Reed and I exchanged worried glances. "I think we should check it out," he said. "You're crazy," I replied. "What if it's some kind of animal?" "Then we scare it off," he said, already pulling on his boots. I hesitated, but eventually did the same. We grabbed the only weapons we had, a couple of kitchen knives, and cautiously opened the RV door. The night air was cool and still, the only sound our breathing and the distant murmur of the creek. We stepped outside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The ground around the RV was undisturbed, no signs of anything unusual. Reed moved ahead, scanning the area with his flashlight. I stayed close behind, my grip tight on the knife. "See anything?" I whispered. "Nothing," he replied, his voice tense. We circled the RV, finding nothing out of place. Just as we were about to head back inside, we heard a rustling noise coming from the trees. Our flashlights snapped in that direction, but we saw nothing. "Maybe it was just an animal," Reed said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, still uneasy. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. Reed fell asleep almost immediately, but I lay awake, listening for any more strange noises. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning, the sun was shining and everything seemed normal. We laughed off the previous night's scare, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, trying to enjoy our trip. That evening, we made a fire and cooked some dinner. As we sat around the fire, Reed brought up the noises again. "You think it could have been someone messing with us?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, "but if it was, they're probably long gone by now." We tried to put it out of our minds and enjoy the rest of the night. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After dinner, we cleaned up and headed inside the RV. We double-checked the locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. I kept my knife close, just in case. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time it was louder and more deliberate. It sounded like something was trying to get in. Reed and I were wide awake, fear gripping us. We listened as the scratching and thumping grew more intense. "We need to get out of here," Reed said, his voice trembling. I nodded, grabbing the keys and our flashlights. We cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The noise stopped immediately, and the night fell silent once again. We made our way to the driver's side, but as I reached for the door handle, something grabbed my arm. I screamed, jerking my arm away. The flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating a grotesque face inches from mine. Its skin was pale and leathery, its eyes sunken and lifeless. It let out a guttural hiss, bearing jagged teeth. Reed swung his flashlight, hitting the creature in the face. It recoiled, giving us a moment to scramble into the RV. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the keys, starting the engine. "Go, go, go!" Reed yelled, looking back at the creature through the window. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward. The creature chased after us, its twisted limbs moving with unnatural speed. We sped down the dirt road, the RV bouncing over the uneven ground. The creature kept pace for a while before finally fading into the darkness. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached a small town. We found a gas station and parked, too shaken to continue. We sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Reed finally asked. "I don't know," I said, my hands still shaking. "But I never want to see it again." We decided to head home the next day, cutting our trip short. As we drove back, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. We debated whether to tell anyone, fearing they wouldn't believe us. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Years later, I still think about that night. Reed and I drifted apart, but we never spoke of it again. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the scratching sound and feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know what that creature was, but I have a name for it now. It's just a name I made up, but it feels right. A name for the thing that haunts my nightmares. I've never been camping since. My name is Alexander Simmons, and this happened in 1997 in the deep backwoods of Olympic National Park, Washington. I've been working search and rescue for about 8 years now, and it's mostly a steady gig looking for lost hikers and the occasional rescue for someone who underestimated the wilderness. I always thought I was pretty good at reading situations and people, but what happened that day, I still haven't quite wrapped my head around. Let me tell you, working SAR isn't glamorous, but it beats staring at spreadsheets or pretending to care about office politics. I came into it by accident, really. I used to work construction before my knee gave out after too many bad landings. The idea of staying cooped up wasn't for me, so I figured why not try something where I'm at least out in the open air? That's how I ended up in the Park Service, trudging through dense forest more often than I'm home. So here I was, minding my business, sipping coffee that could probably fit a car when the call came in. A hiker was missing. Typical. A couple of kids on break from school hiking the Skyline Trail loop, except one of them didn't make it back to camp. According to his friends, he just vanished. Classic. We headed out with the usual team, packed light because we assumed we'd find the guy within a few hours. That's how it goes 9 times out of 10. Someone got turned around, followed the wrong path, and ended up embarrassed when we hauled them back. But this one felt off from the start. The trail was damp from last night's rain, the kind that soaks into your bones. As we moved further into the forest, the canopy got thicker, and that soft green glow you get from the sun filtering through the leaves turned dimmer. The first thing that hit me was the quiet. The woods always have noise, birds, insects, wind, nature humming along, but this stretch, nothing. Not even a rustle of leaves. It was like we'd walked into a soundproof room. We split up to cover more ground. I veered off the main trail toward a ridge where I figured the kid might have wandered. I'd seen too many eager hikers try to cut corners only to realize too late that they were heading straight for a cliff or into a thicket of brambles. As I climbed the ridge, I spotted something odd. A pile of scattered gear. It was one of those bright orange backpacks, half torn open, contents spilled everywhere like someone had rifled through it. A water bottle, a map, some granola bars. But no footprints, no sign of struggle, no blood. Just a pile of stuff like the guy had simply dropped it. I radioed into the others, but all I got was static. That's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye, deeper in the woods. Not a person, though. It was too quick, too large. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but no, this thing moved like nothing I'd ever seen. I'll be real with you. I've got no idea what it was, but it wasn't a bear. It had this hulking frame like a wild boar, but bigger legs, too long, and it moved low to the ground in a way that sent a cold prick up my neck. It wasn't scared of me either. It just stood there for a second, watching, then it bolted. I started after it, because that's what you do, right? I'd be lying if I said I wasn't second-guessing myself, but my legs were already moving. I could still see flashes of it between the trees, darting through thick brush like the undergrowth wasn't even there. The ground underfoot was getting softer, slicker, but I pushed on, barely catching sight of it now. Just a blur. That's when I came across the first body. Not the missing hiker, though. This one was older, bloated, like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. But no animals had gotten to it, which was weird. Bodies left out in the woods, you'd expect something to pick at it. Scavengers, insects. But this one was untouched, except for the gaping wound across its chest, like something massive had clawed it open. I turned away for a moment, trying to get my breath back, when I heard the sound again. That thing wasn't far. There was no time to wait for backup. I had my survival knife on me. Not that it would do much against something this size, but I wasn't about to roll over. I followed the trail again, this time slower, more cautiously. It led me down into a ravine thick with ferns and fallen logs. The further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The forest was darker, and the trees were gnarled and twisted like they'd been fighting for sunlight for centuries. The air was damp and heavy, almost suffocating. That's where I found him, the missing hiker, or what was left of him. He was wedged between 2 fallen logs, his body torn up like something had been gnawing at him. I almost puked. I won't go into detail, but it was bad, real bad. I backed up, trying to process what I was looking at when I heard it again. Low, deep, not like any animal call I'd ever heard, more like a rumble of something alive, something breathing. I turned, knife ready, but it was there before I even had time to react. It was massive, hunched, with muscles rippling under matted fur, or what I think was fur. It wasn't like anything you'd find in an animal guide, that's for sure. Its head reminded me of a wolf, but the rest of it, man, I don't even know. Whatever it was built to kill. It rushed at me faster than I could have imagined something that big could move. I barely managed to dive out of the way, my knee twisting with a sharp crack as I hit the ground hard. For a split second, I thought I was done for, but it paused, looking at me like it was sizing me up. It didn't seem hungry, more like territorial, like I'd wandered somewhere I shouldn't have. I threw my knife at it, not because I thought it would do any damage, but because I was desperate. The thing let out this guttural sound, more frustrated than hurt, and lunged at me again. I scrambled backward, trying to get up, but my leg wasn't having it. It was on me in seconds, claws raking across my arm. But just as fast, it bolted off into the trees again, leaving me there bleeding and shaking. I radioed for help, but again, just static. I figured I had two options: sit there and bleed out or start moving. The adrenaline kicked in, and somehow I managed to drag myself back up the ridge, following the same twisted trail I came in on. When I finally stumbled out of the trees and back onto the main path, I collapsed. The rest of the team found me about 30 minutes later, battered and bleeding but alive. They hauled me back to base, patched me up, and I spent the next week laid up in the hospital. Of course, they didn't find the hiker. Hell, I don't know what happened to his body. It was there 1 minute, then gone the next. They chalked the whole thing up to a bear attack, said I must have been seeing things, maybe concussed from the fall. But I know what I saw, even if no one believes me. I did some digging after I got out of the hospital. Turns out there are old stories about things living in those woods, things that aren't supposed to be there. The locals call them all sorts of names, but the one that stuck with me was the dark wolf. It fits. Whatever it wasn't some regular predator. It was something else. Something that doesn't belong in our world. And here's the kicker. That thing, it didn't want me dead. It could have killed me easily, but it didn't. It let me go. Makes me wonder if it was sending a message, marking its territory. I'm not planning on going back to Olympic anytime soon. Not unless I have to. My name is Benjamin Hamilton. I'm 26 years old, and this happened 2 years ago in CCK Canyon State Park, Texas. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me and my two best friends, Tyler and Liz. We were all in desperate need of a break from our routines. Me from preparing for grad school, Liz from her endless shifts at the ER, and Tyler from his desk job that he claimed was sucking the life out of him. None of us knew that this trip would end up changing our lives forever, or ending one of them. We arrived on a warm Friday afternoon, parking Tyler's beat-up RV in one of the park's more secluded areas. The rock formations were breathtaking, towering red cliffs, endless blue skies, and the occasional herd of bison wandering across the plains. Tyler, as always, was brimming with enthusiasm. "Let's make this weekend legendary," he said, slinging his drone bag over his shoulder. "We're off the grid, no phones, no distractions, just us and nature." Liz rolled her eyes but smiled. She had always been the cautious one in our trio, quick to research every destination and its potential dangers. That's why I wasn't surprised when, as we unpacked, she brought up one of the park's more unsettling legends. "Have you guys heard of the Cannibal of Kapat Rock?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on a picnic table. "Cannibal?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's like a Wendigo thing," Liz explained. "The stories go back to the Comanche tribes. They say a man who eats human flesh out here becomes something else. He's cursed to wander the canyons forever, starving but never dying." "Cool story," Tyler said, brushing her off. "But don't try to scare us before we even set up camp." "I'm serious," Liz muttered, but she didn't press the issue. Looking back, I wish she had. That night, as we sat around a small campfire roasting marshmallows, the wind picked up. It howled through the canyon walls, making eerie whistling noises. Tyler, ever the prankster, started mimicking the wind's sound, laughing as Liz swatted at him to stop. "You're going to summon your Wendigo friend," he teased. "Don't joke about that," Liz snapped, suddenly serious. "Legends like that exist for a reason." I tried to lighten the mood. "Okay, how about we all shut up and enjoy the stars? Look at that sky." It worked for a while. We sat in silence, marveling at the night's beauty. But then we heard it, the first sound that wasn't ours. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but it wasn't. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and animalistic, but somehow wrong. "Coyote?" I whispered. Liz shook her head. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the bushes. "Probably a bison," he said. We didn't see anything, but the growl stayed with me long after we went to bed. The next morning, Tyler wanted to test his new drone. He launched it over the cliffs, letting it soar above the canyon like a bird. Liz and I watched him from the RV's fold-out awning, sipping instant coffee. "Careful with that thing," Liz said. "You're going to lose it out there." "Relax," Tyler replied, watching the drone's footage on his phone. "I've got it under control." Famous last words. A gust of wind sent the drone spiraling, and Tyler's grin vanished as the screen went static. "Crap, it crashed," he said, grabbing his hiking gear. "I'm going to find it." "Alone?" Liz asked, frowning. "It's not far," Tyler said, brushing her off. "I've got my GPS. I'll be back in an hour." He slung his backpack over his shoulder and disappeared down the trail. Liz and I stayed behind, cleaning up the campsite and waiting for him to return. But the hour came and went, and there was no sign of him. Liz was the first to panic. "He should have been back by now," she said, pacing. "He probably got sidetracked taking pictures," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. By late afternoon, we decided to look for him. Using the signal from his phone, we traced his path to the edge of the canyon. That's where we found his backpack. It was ripped, the straps were shredded, and there were smears of blood on the fabric. "Oh my God," Liz whispered, clutching my arm. Nearby, we found his phone still recording. The last video showed the drone's perspective as it crashed near a cave. Tyler's voice was faint but clear. "I think I see it over here." The video cut off. We stared at each other, and I saw the fear in Liz's eyes. "We need to go back to the RV and call for help," she said. "We can't leave him out here," I argued. "Hazel, look at his bag," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever did that?" Her words were cut off by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, the same one we'd heard the night before. It was close. Against my better judgment, I led us toward the cave. The growling grew louder as we approached, echoing off the canyon walls. Liz clutched a flashlight in one hand and a camping knife in the other. Inside the cave, the air was damp and smelled of decay. Animal bones littered the ground, some fresh, others ancient, and on the walls, strange symbols were etched into the rock, spirals, claw marks, and what looked like human figures. "Tyler," I called, my voice shaking. The growling stopped for a moment. There was silence. Then a voice echoed from the depths of the cave. "Hazel, Liz, help me." It was Tyler. Liz bolted toward the sound, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait, that's him," she cried. "Listen," I whispered. "It's coming from all directions." The growl returned, louder this time. A shadow moved at the edge of our flashlight's beam, and then we saw it. The creature stepped into the light, and I froze. It was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with glowing red eyes and antler-like protrusions on its head. "The Wendigo," Liz screamed, dropping her flashlight as the creature lunged toward us. I grabbed her hand and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing moved unnaturally fast, its limbs contorting as it chased us through the canyon. We burst out of the cave and sprinted back toward the RV. The Wendigo didn't stop. It clawed at the rocks, its guttural growls turning into distorted, mocking laughter. "Keep going," I yelled, practically dragging Liz behind me. When we reached the RV, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The creature was right behind us, its shadow stretching long in the moonlight. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. The Wendigo clawed at the side of the RV, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Liz was sobbing, clutching her knife like it could actually help us. As we sped down the canyon road, the creature finally stopped. It stood in the middle of the road, watching us with those terrible glowing eyes. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the park. Liz cried the entire way, and I didn't blame her. Tyler was gone. We never found his body, and the park rangers chalked it up to a wild animal attack, but we knew the truth. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear his voice calling my name, and I know Liz does too. The Wendigo didn't just take Tyler. It left a piece of itself with us, a shadow that will never go away. My name is Chris Erickson, and I was 32 when this happened. It was late August 2022, and I had parked my RV in a remote section of Holly River State Park in West Virginia. I was there to film another episode for my YouTube channel, Trail Tales with Julian. You see, I'd quit my corporate job a year earlier and started traveling solo, documenting my adventures. The views paid for the gas, and the quiet helped me forget the life I'd left behind. That's what I told myself anyway. But what happened in Holly River I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. I arrived just before noon. Holly River was breathtaking, with towering trees and streams that glimmered like silver veins in the sunlight. The air smelled clean and earthy, like a promise of peace. I pulled my RV into a spot deep in the park, far from the other campers. I wanted solitude for the footage, and honestly for myself. The site was perfect, tucked against a hollow surrounded by a thicket of ancient oaks. The moment I stepped out, I felt the stillness, a quiet so deep it pressed against my eardrums. I brushed it off as the charm of being away from civilization. While scouting for shots, I found something strange, a pile of stones near the base of a tree, half covered in moss. Among them was an old, scuffed shoe. It was tiny, like it belonged to a child, and the leather was cracked with age. It gave me a weird chill, but I pocketed it for the sake of storytelling. Every mystery needs an artifact, I joked into the camera. I set up my gear, filmed some establishing shots, and cooked a simple dinner. The first night was calm, even peaceful, until it wasn't. I woke up to laughter. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a high-pitched giggle, the kind of sound kids make when they're playing tag. But it didn't stop. It danced outside my RV, faint and teasing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, expecting to see campers or maybe a group of teenagers messing around. There was no one, just trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called. My voice echoed back at me. The laughter stopped, and the silence rushed in like a weight. The forest didn't feel serene anymore. It felt like it was holding its breath. I shook it off and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near my RV. They were small, like those of a child, but there were no campsites nearby. The tracks led to the hollow and disappeared. I filmed them for my channel, cracking a nervous joke about ghost kids. The rest of the day felt off. My drone crashed during a flight, even though the conditions were perfect. My camera shut off mid-recording, and my backup batteries drained faster than they should have. And then there was this feeling like I was being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but the forest was empty. I started editing footage that evening, hoping the work would calm me down. That's when I noticed it. In one of the clips, as I panned across the hollow, a shadow darted between the trees. It was small, childlike. My stomach dropped. I rewound and watched again. The shadow was there just for a second, but it was enough to make me lock my RV door before I went to bed. The second night was worse. It started with the laughter again, but this time it was closer, louder. I stayed inside, listening as it circled the RV. Then came the singing, a soft, eerie lullaby, just a few notes repeated over and over. I turned on every light I had, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The singing stopped, and I thought it was over until the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap on the windows, on the door, on the walls. Tiny hands testing, probing. I froze, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Go away," I shouted. My voice cracked, weak. The knocking stopped, and the silence returned. The next morning, I decided to leave. This was no ordinary park, no harmless ghost story. Something was wrong with this place. But my RV wouldn't start. The engine whined and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Swearing under my breath, I grabbed my backpack and started hiking to the main road. It was only a couple of miles, or so I thought. No matter which trail I took, I ended up back at the hollow. The trees seemed to shift around me, the paths looping in impossible ways. My GPS was useless. It kept blinking, searching for a signal. As the sun dipped lower, I heard it again, the laughter, the singing. It followed me just out of sight until I stumbled back to my campsite, exhausted and panicked. That night, I saw them, the children. They came as shadows at first, flickering at the edges of my vision. Then they stepped into the firelight. There were 3 of them, their faces pale and hollowed, their eyes dark voids that seemed to pull the light in. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, ragged dresses, suspenders. One of them pointed at me, and they started whispering. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then he appeared, the piper. He was tall, possibly too tall, with limbs that bent at strange angles. His face was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and cruel. He raised one long, bony hand and beckoned. The children moved closer, their whispers turning into a song, sweet and haunting. I scrambled back, my hands fumbling for the flashlight, the camera, anything to protect myself. I don't know how I survived that night. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was sheer stupid luck. But I remembered the shoe, the artifact I'd taken. Desperate, I threw it into the fire. The flames roared higher, and the children screamed, their voices twisting into something inhuman. The piper lunged toward me, his hand outstretched, but the fire seemed to hold him back. As the shoe burned, the shadows dissolved, and the forest fell silent. The piper was gone. When dawn broke, the RV started without a hitch. I drove away, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far from Holly River. Later, when I reviewed my footage, I found something that chilled me to the bone. In one clip, as I filmed myself walking through the hollow, a figure loomed in the background, a tall, dark shape with unnaturally long limbs, the piper. I deleted the footage. Some things aren't meant to be shared. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't often talk about my time as a truck driver, not because it was particularly tough, but because something happened out there one time, and it doesn't leave me much room to trust others with the details. I'm not scarred by it or anything, just cautious about who I share it with. I grew up on the East Coast, always moving from town to town, working dead-end jobs until I stumbled into long-haul trucking. It paid well enough, kept me on the road, and I liked the solitude. My name's Irvin, by the way. I'm Ron Whitman. That day, I was running a load of construction materials from a supply yard in some small town in the Midwest to a building site out in the sticks, an isolated area far from anything you'd call civilization. It was a routine trip, a long stretch of highway with nothing but fields on either side and the occasional farmhouse. I didn't expect anything unusual from the day, but things don't always go as planned. The job took me down a 2-lane road that snaked through miles of untouched land. The sky was a flat gray dome, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or stay dry. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station playing static more than music, as I kept my eyes on the horizon, trying to push through the monotony of it all. I saw him standing on the side of the road about 50 miles from the nearest town, which in itself should have been a red flag. There was nothing around, no broken down car or anything like that. He was just standing there in jeans and a faded red jacket, facing my truck like he knew I was coming. His face was rough, probably mid-40s, unshaven with a square jaw, dark hair buzzed short. His eyes, not that I looked at them long, were intense. Not wild, just piercing, like he had something locked in his mind, something he couldn't let go of. I slowed down as I passed, not intending to stop, but just out of instinct. There was no one else on the road, so I rolled down the window and called out, "Need a ride?" The man didn't answer at first. He just kept staring at me. Then, without a word, he opened the passenger door and climbed in. That should have been another red flag. He didn't ask where I was going, didn't explain what he was doing out there, but sometimes you just go with things because they don't seem out of place until it's too late. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep it casual. "Just up the road," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced out the window, and I noticed his hands were shaking, just barely, like he was trying to keep something bottled up. I shrugged and focused on driving. The truck rumbled along, and for a while, we didn't speak. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, chalking it up to the strangeness of the situation. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, never had an issue, but this guy, there was something off. He wasn't just quiet, he was waiting. Long day? I asked, breaking the silence. He nodded once, still staring out the window. Yeah, long day. I thought about asking more, but let it drop. He wasn't in a chatty mood, and to be honest, neither was I. The road stretched on, straight and empty, and the only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then, maybe 10 minutes in, he shifted in his seat and looked at me. Really looked at me, like he was sizing me up for something. You ever think about how far away everything is? He asked, almost casually. Sometimes, I said, keeping my eyes forward. It's strange, he continued. Being out here where no one can see you, no one knows where you are. You could disappear and no one would ever find you. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. Yeah, but I've got a load to deliver. Hard to disappear with 20 tons of steel behind me. He didn't laugh. People disappear all the time, he said quietly, almost to himself. That was it. The moment I knew I should have pulled over, told him to get out, and driven away as fast as I could. But I didn't. I just nodded and kept driving, trying to shake off the unease building in my gut. The next time he spoke, it was sudden, sharp. Then pull over, I glanced at him, frowning. Why? Just pull over. We were in the middle of nowhere, still a good 20 miles from the next town, and there was no reason for him to want me to stop. I should have ignored him, kept driving, but there was something in his voice, something dark that made me do it. I pulled off to the side of the road, the truck's brakes hissing as we came to a stop. The man turned to face me, fully now, his expression cold, calculating. You know why I'm here, don't you? No, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a long, thin blade, an old hunting knife, worn and pitted with age. The way he held it, casual but deliberate, told me this wasn't the first time he'd used it. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Look, man, if you want money, take it. I don't care. He shook his head. It's not about money. I realized then that this wasn't some random act of violence. This man had picked me for a reason, though what that reason was, I couldn't guess. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Had I cut him off in traffic? Had I taken a job he wanted? Had I unknowingly crossed paths with him before? But none of it mattered. What mattered was the blade in his hand and the look in his eyes that said he wasn't leaving this truck without blood on his hands. You can walk away from this, I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was hammering in my chest. Just leave, and we both go our separate ways. He considered this for a moment, his gaze flicking between me and the knife. Then, without warning, he lunged.